They boarded under that hard December sky. Winter blown thin over New York. Wind scraping the jet bridge rails like a dull knife. Eastern Airlines Flight 401. A late night promise to Miami. A warm landing on the other side of midnight. The L-1011. TriStar gleamed under floodlights. Not new exactly, but new enough to carry a hush of confidence. A feeling that somebody smarter than you had already done the math. In first class, a man in a gray suit folded his paper and let the news ink his fingertips. In coach, a family passed a plastic Santa back and forth, so the little boy could make him dance on the armrest. The flight attendants, stiff smiles softened by routine, moved like practiced magicians. The cockpit, all quiet logic and ritual. Captain Robert Loft, First Officer Albert Stockstill, Flight Engineer Donald Repo. Professional men who could read a gauge like a pulse, who trusted checklists more than prayer. They pushed back under a thrum that lived in the bones more than the ear. Wheels up. New York drooped into a grid of sodium lights, the airplane shouldering its way through the stratosphere, where night widens and the world below forgets you for a while. Hours later, the darkness over Florida had a different pitch, warmer, hollow, the kind that rolls low across water and swamp, and the black blade of sawgrass. In the cabin, the air cooled and softened. Those recycled breaths, coffee, faint perfume, a child's shampoo. The seatbelt signs went off. A man pressed his forehead to the window and tried to pick out the hidden ocean. By the way, the black was more black beyond the wing. Then routine frayed, not with a shriek, but a blink. In front of Captain Loft, a small green lamp, one of those idiot-proof pieces of certainty, refused to do the one job it had. The nose gear down and locked indicator stayed dark, a lost star on a tidy constellation. The crew didn't panic. Professional hands circled the problem. Cycle the gear. Ask the tower for a low pass if needed. They were good men. They respected tiny lights, because tiny lights were often the beginning of big things. The TriStar leveled off into a holding pattern above the Florida Everglades. Under them, a midnight swamp spread like spilled ink, the sawgrass combing the darkness. They were supposed to be above it, floating on instruments, safe within invisible rails. Autopilot on, autopilot off. A bump, a slip, a nudge at a switch that nobody remembered nudging. They pulled a panel, a little lamp lens rolled away and disappeared under a seat. The kind of inconvenience that makes grown men chuckle once and swear twice. Time stretched, thinned. A steward, summoned, wriggled into the avionics bay below the cockpit to stare through a glass porthole at the landing gear. The plane's own periscope to confirm the nose wheel was indeed down. His shoes scraped metal. Up in the cockpit, fingers leaned a little harder on logic. You don't realize how loud a small silence can be until it's in a place that hums. Somewhere between questions and answers, the TriStar drifted. Altitude, bleeding. Needles sliding while the crew's attention made a tunnel out of a burned-out bulb. 170 plus souls. Their lives slung over the night like beads on a wire. A woman in 24C stirred and tugged her cardigan into a blanket. A man jotting on a napkin tucked it into his pocket, thinking he'd finish the thought after the landing. A girl with the hiccups finally stopped, proud and sleepy. In the cockpit, the radio was an extra heartbeat. Check, confirm, verify. Fly the airplane. A phrase pilots say like a proverb. Fly. The airplane. But the swamp rose up the way darkness rises. Quiet, complete, inevitable. The altimeter ticked downward with the patience of a predator. At 11:42 p.m., the L-1011 met the world. The first strike was not a bang, but a tearing metal meeting marsh, an impossible shuddering that turned air into earth in less than a breath. The nose, the belly, the wings, each learned what it meant to be torn apart. The fuselage bit the swamp and bit again, skipping, splitting. seats ripped away, and then the night was water. Freezing black water, and the smell of jet fuel, and hot metal, and mud older than the city it swallowed. Some souls slipped from one world to the next between heartbeats. Others woke into a place of steam and smoke and shouting. Ask survivors what they remember, and they'll tell you the air felt heavy, as if you could lean on it, that the dark had texture like soaked velvet, that the engines screamed the way beasts scream when they die. A stewardess clawed her way to the torn edge of the cabin, fingers slick with fuel, and used a seatbelt like a tether to pull a stranger up from the water. A man who couldn't feel his legs felt the sudden, almost obscene warmth of his own blood in the cold. Someone prayed, and someone cursed in a voice that didn't sound like theirs. A woman called for her husband by his first and middle name, and then by sweetheart, and then by nothing, because names felt too small for a night like this. Above the wreckage, searchlights came eventually, rendered hazy by swamp breath. Airboats throbbed out of the nowhere, the fan blades pushing a wind that raked the sawgrass flat. Deputies in mud-soaked uniforms and fishermen with hands like old rope-hauled bodies onto aluminum hulls stacked them between coolers and ropes and a bucket of tools. The rescue was a choreography of desperation. In the cockpit, Captain Loft and Flight Engineer Repo were beyond rescue, their world reduced to a wedge of mangled metal and quiet. First Officer Stockstill, too. The swamp, the old Florida, older than maps, took a record of everyone it touched. Cuts, bruises, vanished hours. By dawn, the gray light made the place look almost gentle, like the aftermath of a storm. But the night had written something here that would not come off. A plane crashes. People mourn. A government files reports. A company rebuilds. Parts. Good parts salvaged from the wreck. Found new homes in other L1011s. An oven here, a galley latch there. A control module transplanted like a healthy organ. If you've never stood in the quiet belly of a passenger jet, you don't know how alive the silence can be. Every hum a whisper, every click a small certainty. The airline told itself it was sensible. The dead don't mind what their metal does. The living need airplanes to fly, and airplanes do not care about ghosts. Weeks passed. Grief crystallized into the kind of story people tell in kitchens. He worked that flight. She barely missed it. A what if that pokes you awake at 2 a.m. Flight crews traded the practical kindness of casseroles and black coffee. Flight attendants touched hands on jetways and pretended they weren't counting how many stairs they had to climb. Pilots squeezed shoulders, offered gallows humor that is less about laughter than it is about keeping the dam from breaking. The Everglades went on being exactly what it always was. Sawgrass, water, wide sky, hot breath, and if it remembered, it kept its own counsel. Then one night, aboard an L1011, whose galley wore a salvaged oven like a secondhand heart, a flight attendant saw a man she didn't recognize, hunched near the coffee pots, checking the latch. He wore the outline of a uniform without drawing attention to it. The light over the galley was the kind that turns everyone's face into a secret. He didn't answer when she said hello. He lifted his head as if listening to a wind she couldn't hear. He looked tired, genuinely exhausted, that bone-deep weariness that no amount of sleep can clean. She stepped forward, professional, friendly. "Can I help you with something?" The man turned his head. His eyes were old. He said, almost apologetic, "Watch the oven. It sticks." She blinked at the ordinariness of it. She blinked again, and the man wasn't there. Not walked away, not stepped around the corner, but changed from presence to absence as if the film had jumped a frame. She didn't scream. She turned to the metal face of the oven and found the latch half sprung. That's how it began. Not with terror, but with a warning. This wasn't just drifting figures and cold spots. A flight attendant in the rear galley, one who had decided the whole thing was an ugly prank, stood with her hand on the service cart when the little service lamp dimmed, brightened, and went dead. Darkness swallowed the galley in one swallow, the kind that immediately pitches you back to childhood and closets. She reached for her penlight and felt nails. Not claws, not violence, but human nails, drag lightly across the back of her hand. She snatched her fingers away and hit the wall with her shoulder and laughed because the alternative was to scream. The penlight came on, too bright, and her face reflected in the galley's dull metal. Behind her, for one frame, a second face leaned just over her shoulder, eyes patient, as if waiting for her to finish noticing. Other times, the warnings were clean, almost formal. A crew gathered for departure checks, the machine waiting, the runway calling, the night outside the windshield smudged and expectant. The third officer reached for a switch and stopped, not because of training, but because the cabin temperature dropped hard enough that he saw his own breath. In that wintered air, a man's voice, not radio, not intercom, said, "Not that one." Plain. Reasonable. The officer snatched his hand back like a child from a stove. He checked himself, retraced, and saw it. A procedural step he'd skipped because confidence is a snowdrift that can delight you right off a cliff. He performed the step. The breath mist faded. Someone whispered, "Repo?" The way some people whisper, "Amen." They flew. No headlines. Word ran sideways through the airline. Don't talk about it. Not because the company could ban the nature of a thing, but because speaking it too often might fatten it. There were memos about professionalism. There were reminders to bring concerns to maintenance, not to gossip. A supervisor who had never so much as banged his knee on a stair told a cabin crew to report unusual occurrences as inoperative equipment if it involved ovens, lights, or anything not easily explained, and to route safety concerns through formal channels. Somewhere, without a memo, without ceremony, salvage parts began to come off the birds that carried them. New ovens, new latches, fresh modules unknotted from the dead plane's circulatory system, and sealed in crates. And while cause and effect is a game people play when they're afraid of chaos, the stories thinned when the parts went. Not overnight, not completely. Just thinned like fog under a noon sun. Still, the Everglades kept saying something to those who passed over at night. Ask pilots, even ones who smile at ghost stories like they're stray dogs. On certain routes, you glance at the altimeter twice for reasons that have nothing to do with workload. You hold the yoke more gently in your right hand and touch the autopilot knob with your left thumb like a superstition you pretend is a habit. You hear a whisper that is not on the comms and is also not in your head. You may not believe in ghosts, but you believe in checklists, and you believe that the dead can leave warnings in the language of switches. The people who carried Flight 401's last minutes in their bones tell their tales without flourish because they have learned that the quieter a story is, the more it gets in. A survivor who lost 2 teeth in 3 hours says she woke up in a hospital with plastic Christmas bells hanging from the crooked ceiling track, and a nurse leaned over her with a face shaped like kindness and said, "You were spared." The survivor says now, 50 years later, voice notched with cigarettes, that she believes the sparing didn't end that night. That something about the way Captain Loft and Donald Repo left the world made them stick to it too, like fingerprints on glass you can only see when the light hits. They're not the rattling chains kind, she says. They're the turn the knob back kind. The check your gauge kind. If you gotta be haunted, and some of us are, be haunted by those too. A flight attendant who retired early sits with her coffee and laughs small at herself before telling you this one. She was deadheading on a nearly empty TriStar, tired and grateful to be a passenger. She buckled in and closed her eyes and felt the plane's breath in her ribs, that slow press that means you're nearly free of the ground. She heard a cough, the automatic polite cough of a person who wants you to know they're there, and opened her eyes to find a man sitting in the aisle jump seat across from her. Captain's hat, long hands resting light on his knees. The posture of someone who made the word calm seemed like it was invented for him. He nodded once, nothing spooky in it, and said, as if continuing a conversation they'd started hours earlier, "We will not let it happen again." She said nothing because the sentence hit her like a diagnosis and a prayer. She looked down because her eyes were angry with water. When she looked up, the seat was empty. She wanted to unbuckle and flee, and she wanted to stay there forever because some places feel like thresholds. After landing, she walked the length of the plane twice. Nothing. No one. At home, she took the black and white memorial clipping from her Bible and spread it like a map, and found the same long hands, same patient eyes. Robert Loft, the name felt heavier, said out loud. And Donald Repo, the engineer whose job on good days was to be the nervous system of a jetliner. He tended to show up where systems lived. In the guts, near panels, around the places meals quietly begin, and safety occasionally ends. A young mechanic says he scanned the oven power harness while the airplane sat with its own lights low, and a man leaned in beside him and said, "Let me show you something." Not a ghost story voice, not a tremor of cold, just a man talking shop. The mechanic angled his flashlight and didn't see the speaker's face, only his hand, and the neatness of his nails, and the old burn scar that made a parenthesis on the thumb. The hand guided his light to a connector buried just deeper than habit searches, a hairline fray, the kind of microfault that grows fangs in turbulence. The mechanic looked up to say thanks and framed air with his gratitude. He tells this with no expectation you will believe him. He tells it because not telling it makes sleep worse. Years roll as they do, and stories settle into the sediments of an industry that prefers hydraulics to hauntings. But the Everglades under night, when you pass over them in winter, have a way of schooling anyone arrogant enough to think the sky is ours. On some flights, the cabin dims, and a crew member, senior and quiet, will pause in the forward galley and press 2 fingers against the beveled wall and say, not with lips but with the pulse in her wrist, "Stay with us." Like all good rituals, it works whether or not you believe in it. It's not hard to imagine that metal remembers, that ovens remember, that latches know the language of hands. But let's say it isn't memory at all. Let's say it's love, expressed in the only physics it can find. A captain who feels the shame of the word distraction like a stain across his last minutes, and refuses to allow that word near anyone else's final page. An engineer who knows the gravity of one missed connector and the mathematics of one wrong switch, and keeps roaming the aisles of a sky he can't quite leave because there are still parts to check. Still gauges to pat like horses. Pilots who train on the accident review speak clinically because clinical speech is a raft in a river. Controlled flight into terrain. Human factors. Distraction trap. They learn from it. They teach the next ones. They reduce ghosts to lessons because lessons save lives. And saving lives is a language the dead respect. But on nights when the air is honest and the route line drapes across the Everglades like a thin necklace of light, those same pilots sometimes reach to the panel and confirm the status of a down and locked lamp, and allow themselves an extra second of gratitude when it glows. Not for the bulb, for the hands that still hover near it. People asked the airline. The airline denied. Corporate mouths shape words like no evidence the way weather maps shape storms. It may be true by any measure that would hold up in a courtroom, but truth has more rooms than that. Ask the attendants who wouldn't work the galley with a salvaged oven and swapped assignments like poker players swapping chairs. Ask the mechanic who wrote up a phantom smell of hot dust that disappeared every time he invited someone else to notice it. Ask the gate agent who watched a woman in Arrival claim check-wiped tears she refused to name because she felt ridiculous, telling a stranger that a ghost had looked out for her. Ask the survivors who talked to the ceiling air vent as the plane taxis, a small private communion between man and machine, and whoever stands between them. Flying remains the strangest and most ordinary miracle we do daily. People climb into a metal room, buckle themselves to intention, and trust strangers to guide them across weather and darkness to a runway painted like a promise. Maybe the dead who love this work, who die doing it, stay longer than most. Not to rattle trays or dim lights for fun, but to stand in doorways you can't see, and nod once when the list is complete. Maybe haunted is just our clumsy word for accompanied. And if you ever find yourself in the hush of a late flight, when the cabin is a long throat of blue shadow, and the coffee has gone stale, and the galley door sighs against its frame, double the times you think it should, you might feel it. That presence that is less boo and more be careful. You may catch a reflection in the polished face of an oven, a hat brim, and tired eyes. And when you turn, it's only your own reflection, widened by the tricks of light and fatigue. Or maybe not. Maybe the men who learned the hard way, what a single lamp can cost, still walk the aisle in the thin altitude of now, telling us with patience older than the swamp, fly the airplane. The Everglades, for their part, never confess. They lay flat and bright in daylight and rise into forever at night. And all the while they keep the sound of engines, the prayer of metal, the names of the lost. When the moon is on them, the sawgrass looks like hair combed by a giant's hand. Airboats still glide across their skin. Egrets still stand on one leg, as if they have found an old secret and refuse to share it. Somewhere under inches or miles of water, there is metal that has begun turning back into earth. Somewhere in a sky above that water, there are men in uniforms who still have work to do. You don't have to believe in ghosts to be grateful for them. You only have to picture a tired captain standing in a forward galley he doesn't belong to anymore, looking toward a door that opens onto nothing and nodding once, satisfied, as a lamp clicks green. And you picture the engineer, sleeves rolled, hands neat, the burn scar on his thumb curling like a parenthesis around a last unfinished sentence, teaching the living the geometry of care one more time. If you listen while the wheels come down and the cabin trembles and a baby stirs and the world presses in with gravity like a hand on your chest, you might hear it. The simplest benediction in the language of altitude. We will not let it happen again. If this story followed you into the dark tonight, tell me one thing. Would you knowingly fly on a plane built with parts from a crash if the ghosts guarding it were the very crew who died? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you love true horror and chilling legends told like this, hit the like button and subscribe to Spooky Chilling Tales. New stories are coming. Don't miss the next one.